feed into this project. And right now I've got 7 different types of primary sources. Each of them are valuable in their own way, and they all tie together. And a lot of this is a lot of stuff that Tracy mentioned. I'm going to do Luke's going to do about a 20-minute demo where we're going to actually step through the database live, and you'll see what the search screens look like, and I'll point out some of the things that might not be really obvious if you're going through it for the first time. There's a lot of really cool information that you can do to get some demographic profiles, find out where these people came from, where they went to, age groups, things like that. A lot of people have asked questions. Luke's come up with some really interesting questions that I've tried to mine from the data. And then I want to talk about, moving forward, where are we in terms of this project? What are the things that we could do in the future? And I'm going to solicit a lot of help because there have been just a handful of us that have really fed content into this project. And I really appreciate those of you in this room who've helped me out for the last several years reading manifests and abstracting information out of the marriage records and things like that. Okay. So what is the Armenian Immigration Project? And I just kind of came up with that name. It's probably not the best name to use, but that's kind of what came to mind. And how did it come to be? So really what it is I wanted some place where I could abstract information from these primary sources, put it in a format where anybody anywhere in the world using a web browser could get at the information that they want to get at and find the record. Okay, so it's an index, it's an abstract. It was not intended to replace actually looking at the original record. And the last person that came up here raised a really good point, and that is if you look at an abstract or an index, you're going to miss a lot of really good information that was not included in the fields that were abstracted. If you look at the original record, you may come to a different conclusion about how a particular place or personal name was spelled. And there's a lot of really good gems that are not going to be included in the abstract. So my intent was, this will help you find a record, but then you would go online and actually find that original document and read through there and find some other neat things. So I've got a searchable database that I put online about a year ago. I finally figured out how to do that. That ties the different types of records together. And one of the things I've started doing recently is adding photographs. I've got about 805 photographs right now in the database that I'm attaching to different records. So you'll pull up somebody's census record or their ship manifest record, and even though that record itself doesn't have a photograph, there was some other record for that individual that had their photograph, maybe taken in 1915, 1920, 1930, that showed what they looked like way back then, and I've attached it to every single record that's linked to that individual. And I think that's really important to be able to see what these people look like coming out of the refugee camps in 1920. And I've got the capability, and I'm going to go through that, but I'm pulling it mainly from passports and naturalization records, okay? But many of you have family photographs of these same individuals that are not in any of those records. And I would say if you find somebody in a ship manifest on my database and you want their picture from the I'm trying to find headshots from 1950 and earlier to attach to those records. Just send them to me in an email, and I'll attach it to that record. Okay, there's multiple types of primary sources that feed into the database. I've got them listed here. Right now I've got 7 different types of primary records, and I'm going to talk about how important that is to tie these different records together to get a much more complete picture of that individual. And not only are we getting tying different records together for the same individual, we can tie individuals to other people that are relatives and friends and things like that they live with, or that they listed as their nearest relative, and then we can go to that individual directly from the same record in the database and find out a bunch of information about that person. So that's really the gist of this, is it's a tool for finding primary sources, but then I want you to go to those primary sources directly and look at the original images. Almost everything out here is available online. Guys like George and other people have traveled all over Turkey and Armenia and, looked at archives and things like that. Unfortunately, I'm like an armchair genealogist. Most of what I've done is from my desk at my office, digging through the internet. So whatever I have out here, you'll be able to find as well. Okay, so why is something like this necessary? I'm 1/4 Armenian. 3/4 of my ancestry is primarily, I'm 1/4 French Canadian, English and German. Most of the rest of my family, other than my Armenian grandfather, were in either Canada or United States, America, from the 1600s onward. And I got really spoiled digging through those records because there's just a whole gold mine of all kinds of, censuses back to 1850 in the U.S., 1851 in Canada that have every member of the household. You have birth records, marriage records, and all that kind of stuff. So I got really spoiled during the first few years from 1968 to 1971, where a lot of my research was based on my French, German, English ancestry. And then when I started getting involved in my Armenian ancestry, none of this stuff existed. I pretty much assumed that all the records from Turkey where my grandfather came from had been totally lost, and now we're finding that that's not even the case. Okay, a lot of the generations are no longer living. Tracy talked about finding your 100-year-old relative. I strongly encourage that. I'm going to talk a little bit about how I use that technique to find some of the information that I started with. The records are very fragmentary in nature, the ones that are available for the Middle East. George and some others have done some great work in uncovering some of these things that are in the Turkish archives that we thought were lost forever. Now you got to read Ottoman script that even the Turks living there today can't read. So that's a challenge. Some of the really good records that are available in some of these churches, particularly in the Boston area, and some of the newspapers and magazines from the 1910s and 1920s are written in Armenian. I can't read Armenian, I can't read Turkish, I can read French and I can read English, and that's about it. Okay? I know a lot of you can read some of these other languages, and that's one of the really great things about this Facebook group is we have people out there, a lot of you in this room that have a great range of skills, experiences, contacts, and things like that I never knew existed. And Tracy invited me to join this group about a year ago, and now I realize there are people out here that can do all these things that I can't do. So that's one of the things I really like about this particular group. Some of you probably are French Canadian and have had some experience with the PRDH. I know Luke and I have spent a lot of time tracing our French ancestry, and it's a online database where you can link different people and records together. How many people have worked with PRDH? Okay, just a handful. How many people have seen this website that I built? Okay. How many people haven't? Okay, so good. So this looks like it's about half and half. So hopefully there'll be some good information in here. I've got links to all this stuff so you can actually do this yourself when you get home. Okay, so what's my background? How did I get started? I'm 1/4 Armenian. My father's father was an Armenian immigrant born in eastern Turkey in the Erzurum province, a little village there called Sergaville. He came over in 1906, started out in Granite City, Illinois, working in the iron steel manufacturing mills there, Malleeville Iron Company. He was there with some first cousins of his, some of his brothers, all male. Some of them went to Detroit, so I've got a lot of relatives in Detroit. Arslanian was the family name. My grandfather and one of his brothers and a nephew went to Salem, Oregon, so they were there in the 1910 census. They were living in a house with two other Armenian men whose grandchildren and great-grandchildren actually are in the Facebook group I found. Yeah. And he married a French-Canadian woman in Yakima, Washington in 1918. They had 7 kids. Eventually, by about 1932, they made it to Fresno, California, and that's where they remained for many years. My dad was half Armenian, married a woman who was English and German ancestry. So anyway, that's how I got started. When I was 11 years old, 1968, I started getting interested in genealogy, and I spent several years working on my American ancestors who were English and German, and then my Canadian ancestors who were French. But around 1971, when I was 14, I wanted to get started on my Armenian genealogy. I didn't live in an Armenian community. I lived outside of Fresno and up and down the West Coast. Didn't know any of my Armenian relatives, the ones that were living in Detroit and some other places. And I never met my grandfather. He died when I was 8 years old. He was estranged from the family, so I didn't have any of the benefit of growing up in the Armenian culture. Okay, but I asked my dad when I was 14. I said, "What do you know about your?" He says, I know nothing. I said, and he had no interest whatsoever. Not until he was about 75 did he actually start to have an interest in this stuff when he saw what we could accomplish. But he pointed me to one of his first cousins who was 32 years older than him. We called him Uncle George, but he was my dad's first cousin, lived in Santa Rosa, California. So Dad says, why don't you reach out to Uncle George? So, this goes to Tracy's point. George was born in 1895, came over in 1912 before the genocide. His family, wife, and kids were killed there. But I sent George a letter asking him, what can you tell me? I said I met you at some family reunions. Here's who I am. He sent me down a really nice note back with a bunch of information there. And then I sent him a questionnaire back. I filled out a questionnaire, or I just wrote it down longhand, 1971. He answered every single question in detail, sent it back to me like the next day. And he and I had this correspondence going back and forth, probably 20 or 30 letters during the course of a couple of years. And then what was really important is he put me in contact with some other cousins of his, two of whom survived the death marches and were, refugees, and they came to America after the war, a couple of people in France. So it's like Tracy was talking about, at least back in those days, I was able to talk to those people. They've been long dead, but that's how I got started. So I just had this correspondence going with my dad's first and second cousins, all over the world. And then what I would do is I would send a questionnaire to one of them, a guy about 75 years old who survived the death marches. And then I would send the same questionnaire to another one and ask him exactly the same questions. And probably 80% of the answers were the same, 20% were a little bit different. But that gave me some confidence that 80% that was the same was probably pretty truthful. And one of the themes I've learned from that experience is don't accept something as gospel if you see it in one source. You need to look for the same information across a variety of different sources, compare them, see where the differences are, see where the similarities are, and then you can kind of get some confidence that this is real or maybe there was a mistake in one of these sources. You have to reconcile differences between sources, and you'll find that all the time. And that's one of the reasons why now I have 7 different sources that feed into this thing. Because if you look at one of these records, you may see 4 or 5 different birthdates for the same individual, which leads me to believe that that individual probably didn't know exactly when they were born. So that's an important theme of this. So I did this for several years, and then somewhere in the mid-1980s, I came across this book by Robert Barak called Corn Between Two Lands, and it was a great book, really talking about this thing that I thought I was the only person interested in, which is Armenian immigration to the U.S. and Canada during the time before World War I. So I read that book, and I thought, hey, this is really cool stuff. These are a lot of the experiences that were faced by these early immigrants, including my grandfather and his brothers and cousins. Fast forward to around 2000, 2001, I went to the Ellis Island website and I found my grandfather's immigration record. November 1906, he came from Le Havre, France to Ellis Island, and then, I thought, hey, this is really neat. I actually found his name on a ship manifest, and it told who he was joining. He was joining one of the older brothers who was actually the father of my Uncle George. Okay, and I thought, hey, this is really good. I'm actually seeing this name that I heard about in some of these letters, and then I started finding some of his cousins and brothers and things like that, and then I thought, well, gee, wouldn't it make sense for me to try to find other people from his village and other people from Erzurum and other people from Kari to see if maybe I could try to piece these different pieces together to maybe come up with some relationships. So that's really what I started in 2001. I ended up finding about almost 2,700 ship manifest entries over the next couple of years that looked like they were from this part of Turkey, and put it in some spreadsheets, and then I kind of set them aside for a few years, and then in 2005, when family tree DNA started becoming available, I thought, well, maybe I order one of these DNA tests and I can find a bunch of relatives that way. So I ordered a Y chromosome DNA test. I think it was 25 markers at that time. And back then, there were very few projects. So I thought, well, why don't I start this thing called the Armenian DNA Project? And then maybe I can get a bunch of other Armenians to come in there, and I might find all these matches, find people from my grandfather's village I didn't know about. So anyway, I started the Armenian DNA Project, and we got maybe, maybe 20 or so people over the next few years, because I had no contacts in the Armenian community. So I really didn't go out and evangelize, so it really kind of, not much happened with that. And then in 2009, Peter Preshdakian from Belgium, he called me up on the phone, says, you know, I found this project out here. He says, my interest is in Armenians coming from all over the world, not just Kyrie. So I said, well, you're welcome to join the project. And then so I pretty much handed it over to Peter because he had the energy and a lot of contacts all around the world. And Peter's grown this thing to about 1,200 people right now from all over the world. He brought in Hovan Simonian, a historian who I think Hovan lives in somewhere in Europe. Switzerland, yeah, Switzerland. So Peter and Hovan have pretty much been driving the project. I kind of stepped back because, you know, they were doing things that I couldn't have done with that. And then we, you know, so that project now is about 1,200 people, and I think you know, anybody who is not a part of that project, you know, really needs to order Y chromosome tests and autosomal DNA tests, which Family Tree DNA calls Family Finder. We have, what, 40 kids here? Okay, so I think George will probably get up later and talk about the logistics for, if you want to get tested, we have kits here that you can buy, and we negotiated some volume discounts. Okay, so I looked at the success that Peter and Hovan had in enlarging this project from just this one little piece of Turkey to all Armenians, and I thought, well, maybe it's time for me to do the same thing with the Ship Manifest project. So what I did then is I said, you know, in going through these manifests to dig out these 2,700 entries, I passed over all the entries from Khazaria and Arput and, you know, all these different, Everett and all these other places. So I went back to the same Ship Manifest and just started abstracting those records as well. You know, and I got 5,000 entries, 10,000 entries, 15,000 entries, and then I started expanding it to look at, well, gee, I wonder if I can find the same person in the census records. I wonder if I can find their marriage record in the United States. I wonder if I can find them on a naturalization record. I wonder if I can find their death record. And then I started building some other spreadsheets of death records and things like that. I was really focusing on the areas where my family lived. Granite City, Illinois, East St. Louis, Illinois, Troy and Watervliet, New York, Niagara Falls, Detroit, Fresno, and some of these areas. And so I had a bunch of these different spreadsheets, and I started putting these different spreadsheets online. But I thought nobody's going to want to dig through a 4,000 or 5,000 page spreadsheet, even though I had them online, and on Luke and some of these other people dug through those spreadsheets. I thought there's got to be a better way to present this information. So about a year ago, I did a little Googling around to find where I could create a web site that would allow people to find information more easily. So I found I don't know how many IT people there are in here, but I found an open source database, which means it's free, I don't have to pay for it, that I was able to put on a website, and then I figured out how to write PHP code and HTML code where I could present some search screens, and we're going to demo that shortly to show how you can actually go into this database that has 100,000 records and actually find stuff, okay? My background was in IT. I retired 2 years ago from 35 years at IBM. So, you know, I had some programming background, and that lent itself pretty well to this. Okay, so I said I had 7 primary sources. You hear the term primary source for me. Tracy's talked about primary sources. What is a primary source? A primary source is an original record. It's typically handwritten record, although the later ones will be typed. But the key thing is it's a record that was created at the time of the event. When somebody immigrated, my timekeeper here. Okay, so a primary record is a record that was created at the time of the event. When the person died, when the person was born, when they were married, when they came over on a ship manifest, when they applied for a passport, when they applied for naturalization, okay? So being created at the time of the event, a lot of that information on there is going to be factually accurate. Compare that with a secondary source, like an obituary, which has obituaries are pretty reliable in telling when the person died, who their current relatives are. They're very unreliable, like death certificates, in terms of talking about where the person was actually born, what their parents' names were, because it's only as good as the person 50 years later, 70 years later, who's trying to remember that information. So primary sources are key. Every one of these primary sources that I have in my database, you can find online, okay? Key one is ship manifest. For one reason, that's where I started. Another reason is ship manifest, in theory, exists for every single person who came into the United States or Canada during that time period. I know there are going to be some exceptions. Some people have stories about, you know, my relative came in on a rowboat. Right? Was that person here? Okay, there she's back there. She had a story in her family about her ancestor coming over to Detroit on a rowboat, and you know, we kind of laughed at that, whatever. But I found a border crossing document, and it said, "How do you get here?" And it said rowboat. But the key thing is that person was on a document, and that person came in. This is coming in from Canada. And that person actually came in through Canada on a ship, and was on a ship, had a ship manifest there, but did come through on a rowboat. Okay. So what I did is then I added some of these other things, but every single one of these databases are online. You know, you might not find death records for a particular location online, but so it's still kind of fragmentary. But every couple of years, you know, every few months, some locale puts their death records online, puts their naturalization records online. So it's growing, as we do this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through very briefly, so George doesn't come up here again, what some of the primary sources are. But the key point is start with the ship manifest. So if I can find somebody on a ship manifest, what I do is I put a record out there. I abstract the information from these 2 pages of the ship manifest. Ship manifests were 2 pages only starting in 1907. Before that, there were only 1 page and less information the farther you go back. But if they arrived and stayed in America, at least for some period of time, and by America I mean the U.S., United States, or Canada, it's North America, they leave behind other information. You know, they should appear on the censuses, 1910, 1920, 1930, 1940. You know, they may have left a death certificate, they may have gotten married, maybe their kids got married, naturalization records, and so on. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to find, for one individual, all the records related to that individual. And what I really struggled with when I was creating this thing a year ago is how do I tie the different records together? What I envision is to bring up a page, like the ship manifest page, and have a link to all the other records I found for that individual, and even more importantly, find a link to other people that person was connected to. You know, a brother they were joining in America, somebody they were leaving in Turkey or Russia or the Middle East or whatever. So that was my vision, is to be able to tie these different records together so you can look at these people more holistically. And so what are the advantages of that? If I can look at these records linked, I have a much better idea of getting a much more complete picture of that individual. And here are some of the types of information that we can get. The last one there you see is photos. And you know, I love to have the person's face staring back at me when I'm looking at one of their records. It just kind of humanizes it a little bit. Showing interrelationships. So when that person joined or came to the United States, they had to indicate who they were joining in the United States. That was one of the requirements on the form. You know, it might be a brother, it might be a brother-in-law, you know, it might be a child. Okay, so that's on the record. And the other thing, very, very important, is whenever you get 7 or 8 records for that individual, 3 or 4 of those records might show a place of birth, might show a birth date. They're never going to match up exactly. The spelling is